No one noticed when it entered. There was no sudden shift in the air, no sound sharp enough to break attention, no movement dramatic enough to demand immediate focus. The room remained exactly as it had been seconds before. Calm, familiar, safe, at least by every visible measure that people rely on without thinking. That is what made it dangerous. Because danger does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it moves quietly, precisely, and without interruption, entering a space not as a disruption, but as something that blends into the background until it is too close to ignore. And by then, the moment has already begun to close. The baby lay nearby, still, relaxed, completely unaware of anything beyond its immediate comfort. Its small movements followed no pattern of urgency, no sign of distress, no instinct that something had entered its space that did not belong there. The world, from that perspective, remained unchanged. But it was not. Along the edge of the room, partially hidden by shadows and objects that broke the line of sight, something moved. Slowly, deliberately. The snake did not rush. It did not need to. Its motion was controlled, its body adjusting to the environment with precision that required no sound to support it. Each shift forward was measured, each pause intentional, as if it understood exactly how to move without being seen. Its presence was not dramatic. That is why it went unnoticed. People in the room continued as they were, their attention directed elsewhere, their awareness focused on things that felt more immediate, more relevant, more deserving of thought. Conversations, small movements, routines that filled the space with normality. None of them looked in the direction that mattered. None of them saw what had already entered. The snake advanced further. Its position changed from distant to near, from irrelevant to critical. But the transition happened without drawing attention. The distance between it and the baby closed gradually, not in a way that triggered urgency, but in a way that maintained the illusion of safety for as long as possible. That illusion is what allowed the moment to form, because nothing interrupts what no one notices. The baby shifted slightly, a small movement that carried no meaning beyond comfort. Its position adjusted within the same space that was no longer safe, bringing it even closer to the path the snake had already committed to. There was no awareness in that movement, no recognition of proximity, just continuation. The snake responded, not with aggression, but with alignment. Its body adjusted subtly, tracking the new position, recalculating distance, maintaining the same slow advance that had gone unnoticed from the beginning. Its head lifted slightly, not high, not obvious, but enough to refine its focus on the target in front of it. The space between them was no longer wide. It had narrowed into something precise, something measurable, something that no longer allowed for delay. And still, no one saw it. The room remained filled with the same quiet normality, the same sense that nothing had changed. The absence of alarm reinforced that belief, creating a moment where danger existed fully, but awareness did not. Except for one person. Across the room, his eyes shifted. Not randomly, not casually, but with the kind of focus that comes from noticing something that does not belong. At first, it was just movement, a subtle change in the environment, something that broke the pattern of stillness in a way that demanded a second look. His gaze fixed on it, not because it was obvious, but because it was different. And difference matters, especially in a space where everything else remains the same. He saw the shape, the direction, the intent behind the movement, and in that instant, the illusion of safety disappeared completely. What others had missed, he understood immediately. The snake was not just present. It was positioned, aligned, ready, and the baby was directly in its path. The moment changed. Not in the room, not for anyone else, but for him. Because now, there was no uncertainty left, no time to question, no possibility of ignoring what he had just seen. The danger no one saw had already reached the point where it could not be allowed to continue, and the next second would decide everything. His first instinct was the same as anyone else's would be. Move, stand up, cross the distance, get between the danger and the child before the moment completed itself. The solution was obvious, immediate, and built into the way most people react without thinking. When something is wrong, the body responds. But his body did not. The command formed instantly in his mind, clear and urgent, but it stopped there. It did not travel into motion. It did not translate into action the way it once might have. The connection between intention and movement had been broken long before this moment ever arrived. And now, in the exact second where movement meant everything, that limitation stood between him and what needed to be done. He remained where he was, not by choice, but by reality. The distance between him and the baby was no longer just space. It was a barrier defined by everything he could not do. Every second that passed reinforced that barrier, making it feel larger, more fixed, more impossible to overcome through the methods others would rely on without hesitation. He could not stand. He could not run. He could not reach the child in the time the situation demanded. And yet, he could see exactly what was about to happen. That is what made the moment unbearable. Because awareness without immediate ability creates pressure unlike anything else. It forces the mind to confront a situation fully, without the relief of instant action. It compresses time, turning seconds into something heavier, something that demands a response even when the body cannot provide it in the expected way. His eyes did not leave the snake. Every movement it made became sharper, more defined, more urgent as the distance closed further. He tracked its position, its alignment, the way its body adjusted toward the baby with quiet precision. There was no doubt left, no ambiguity. The situation had already crossed into something critical. His breathing changed, not out of panic, but out of focus. The world around him began to narrow, reducing everything down to the elements that mattered. The room faded. The background noise disappeared. The presence of others became irrelevant. Only 2 points remained clear: the snake, the baby, and between them, a distance that was disappearing. His hands tightened slightly, a reflex that remained even when larger movement was no longer possible. His posture shifted as much as it could, leaning forward, as if reducing even the smallest fraction of space might somehow matter. But it did not. Not in the way he needed. The limitation was absolute. There was no hidden reserve of strength that would suddenly return. No moment where his body would respond differently than it had for so long. The rules that defined what he could and could not do remained unchanged, even as the situation demanded something beyond them. That is what made the next realization so important. If he could not move the way others would, then he would have to act differently. The instinct to give up did not exist. There was no hesitation that suggested inaction was acceptable. The limitation did not remove responsibility. It only changed the way that responsibility had to be fulfilled. His mind shifted, not away from the problem, but deeper into it. It began to process the environment in a different way, searching for variables that could still be used, for elements that remained within his control, for anything that could alter the outcome without requiring what he could not physically do. The snake moved closer. The baby remained unaware. Time continued to compress. And within that narrowing space, something else began to form. A new approach. A different kind of action. Because while his body could not respond in the expected way, his awareness had already gone further than anyone else in the room. And that difference was about to matter more than anything else. The baby had no awareness of what was happening. There was no instinct warning it to move. No understanding of danger, no ability to interpret the presence that had entered its space. Its world was limited to comfort, to small movements, to a sense of safety built entirely on trust in the environment around it. And that trust was complete. Its body shifted slightly, a natural adjustment, nothing urgent, nothing defensive. Its hands moved without purpose, beyond curiosity. Its breathing remained calm, steady, untouched by the tension that had already taken hold elsewhere in the room. It did not see the snake. It did not feel the danger. It did not know that every second was bringing something closer that could not be reasoned with, could not be delayed once it decided to act. That is what made this situation so critical, because vulnerability is not just about weakness. It is about absence of awareness. The baby had no way to protect itself, no ability to move out of the path, no instinct that could override the calm it existed within. It remained exactly where it was, and that position had already become dangerous. The space around it had changed, even if nothing appeared different on the surface. What had been safe seconds before was no longer safe now. The difference was not visible to everyone, but it was real, precise, and closing in. The snake continued its approach. Its movement remained controlled, silent, and uninterrupted. It did not rush because it did not need to. The distance between it and the baby had reduced to something critical, something that no longer allowed delay without consequence. Its head lifted slightly higher now, not enough to draw attention, but enough to refine its focus. The alignment between them tightened. The baby's position, the snake's trajectory, the point where both would meet. All of it had begun to form into a single moment that would not allow correction once it was completed. And still, the baby remained unaware. Its small movements continued, shifting its position by inches that carried more significance than it could possibly understand. Each movement altered the angle slightly, but not enough to escape the path the snake had already adjusted to follow. The vulnerability remained complete. There was no resistance, no defense, no interruption. The room, from the outside, still held its appearance of normality. Nothing had exploded into chaos. No one had shouted. No sudden reaction had broken the flow of the moment. And that is what made it so dangerous. Because the absence of visible urgency allowed the situation to continue uninterrupted. The baby was left unprotected, not because no one cared, but because no one else had seen what was coming in time to act, except him. From where he sat, the reality was clear. There was no one closer, no one already moving toward the child, no one positioned to intervene before the moment completed itself. The responsibility had shifted entirely onto him. And yet, the distance between him and the baby remained unchanged. The limitations still existed. The time still collapsed. The snake moved closer. The baby remained still. And the space between danger and vulnerability became almost non-existent. This was the point where action could no longer be delayed. Because once the snake committed to its final movement, nothing would stop it. And in that exact moment, where the baby had no protection and no awareness, the situation reached its most critical state. It did not rush. That is what made it so difficult to detect. The snake moved with a level of control that removed urgency from its appearance, replacing it with something far more dangerous. Precision. Each movement forward was measured, almost patient, as if time itself worked in its favor. There was no sudden motion to draw attention, no erratic behavior that might trigger alarm. Only progress, slow, deliberate, uninterrupted. Its body glided across the floor, adjusting to every surface, every obstacle, every slight change in position without making a sound. The scales brushed against the ground with a softness that left no trace, no indication strong enough to break the normal rhythm of the room. That is how it closed the distance. Without being noticed, without being challenged, without being stopped. The space between it and the baby was no longer wide enough to allow comfort. It had entered a range where action could happen at any moment, where the difference between stillness and attack was measured in fractions of time, and still, it moved. Its head remained low at first, aligned with its body, following the same controlled path it had maintained from the moment it entered. But as the distance narrowed further, something changed. Not dramatically, subtly, its posture shifted. Its head lifted slightly, just enough to adjust its angle, to refine its focus on the target in front of it. The movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried meaning. It signaled readiness. It marked the transition from approach to preparation. This was no longer just movement. It was positioning. The baby remained still, unaware, unprotected. The contrast between them could not have been greater. One existed in complete calm, without knowledge of danger. The other moved with silent intent, closing in with precision that required no noise to be effective. The alignment tightened further. The distance reduced again. Every second that passed brought the moment closer to completion. And still, nothing interrupted it. The room continued as if nothing was wrong. The absence of sound reinforced the illusion that everything remained safe. No sudden reaction, no raised voice, no shift in attention that might have broken the sequence. Except for him. From his position, every detail became sharper. The way the snake adjusted its path, the way its body curved slightly to maintain direction, the way its head remained fixed on the baby, never drifting, never losing focus. He understood what that meant. This was not random movement. It was intent, and intent leads to action. His awareness tracked every change, every subtle shift that brought the snake closer to the point where it would no longer wait. The moment was forming with precision, each second removing another layer of possibility, reducing the options available to prevent what was coming. The silent advance had reached its final stage. There was no more distance to absorb, no more time to delay. The next movement would not be slow. It would be immediate, decisive, irreversible. And in that exact moment, just before the snake committed to that final action, everything depended on what he would do next. It was not the snake itself that changed the moment. It was what he noticed about it. Up until then, everything had been moving toward predictable outcome. The distance had closed. The alignment had formed. The baby remained still. The snake advanced with precision. The sequence was clear, and unless something interrupted it, the next second would complete it. But then, something shifted. Not in the room. Not in the baby. In the snake. Its movement changed, slightly, almost imperceptibly to anyone not watching closely. But he saw it. The slow, controlled advance that had defined its approach began to tighten. The pauses between movements shortened. The body, once extended in a steady glide, began to coil just enough to alter its structure. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough to signal a transition. This was no longer approach. This was preparation. Its head lifted a fraction higher. Its focus sharpened. The angle of its body adjusted in a way that aligned directly with the baby's position, removing any remaining deviation. The path was no longer flexible. It was fixed. And that fixed point was the baby. That was the detail that changed everything. Because it meant one thing. The strike was imminent, not in seconds, in less. The difference between observation and action had collapsed into a single moment. There was no longer time to consider options, no space left for hesitation, no possibility that the situation might resolve on its own. It would not. The snake had reached the point where instinct would take over, and instinct does not wait. His mind processed it instantly. The coiling, the lift, the alignment. Each detail confirmed the same conclusion. The next movement would not be slow. It would be fast, direct, final. The baby remained unaware. Its small movements continued, unchanged, unguarded, existing within a space that had already become lethal. There was no defense, no reaction, no interruption coming from that direction. Everything depended on him. And now, the margin for action had disappeared. This was no longer about stopping the approach. It was about interrupting the strike. That is a different kind of timing. It requires precision beyond speed. It demands action within a window so small that even a fraction of delay becomes failure. He understood that, not through theory, but through the clarity of what he was seeing. The detail he noticed removed all uncertainty. It forced a decision, immediate, absolute. There was no longer a question of what might happen, only what he would do before it did. His body, limited as it was, could not respond in the way most would expect. But his awareness had already gone further than anyone else in the room. And now, that awareness had reached its final point, the exact second where action could no longer wait. Because the next movement would not belong to it. It would belong to the snake. And if that happened, nothing could stop it. There was no time to think in steps, no sequence of options to evaluate, no space to consider what might work best, no pause to weigh risk against outcome. The moment had already collapsed into something immediate, something that demanded action without delay. And yet, his mind moved, faster than the situation, faster than the limitation of his body. In that fraction of a second, everything around him became a calculation, not in numbers, but in possibility, distance, objects, angles, timing. Every element in the room was no longer background. It was potential, the baby, the snake, the space between them, and everything within reach. He could not stand. He could not close the distance in the way others could. But that did not mean he could not act. It only meant the action had to be different. His eyes shifted quickly, scanning what remained under his control. The surface beside him, the objects within arm's reach, the direction he could extend, the force he could generate, the speed he could achieve from a seated position. The solution would not be perfect. It did not need to be. It only needed to interrupt. The snake's body tightened further. The moment was almost gone. There was no room for hesitation. His hand moved. Not randomly, not desperately, but with purpose. He reached for the nearest object he could use. Something with enough weight, enough reach, enough presence to alter the space between the snake and the baby. His fingers closed around it quickly, without adjustment, without testing. There was no time to refine the choice. It would have to work. His posture shifted forward as much as it could, aligning his body with the direction of the threat. Every part of him that could contribute to the action focused on that single movement. His arm extended, his grip tightened, his focus locked. The plan was simple, not because the situation was simple, but because complexity had no place in a moment like this. Interrupt the strike. Disrupt the alignment. Break the sequence before it completes. That was all that mattered. The margin for error was gone. The timing had to be exact. Too early, and the snake would adjust. Too late, and nothing would matter. He did not wait. He could not. The moment did not allow it. His arm moved forward. Fast. Direct. Committed. There was no hesitation left. No second thought. Only action. Because when time disappears, the only thing that remains is the decision to act within what is still possible. And in that exact second, that is what he did. His body did not rise. It could not. But that did not stop the motion. The action began from where he was, grounded, limited, and yet fully committed. There was no attempt to do what he could not do. No wasted effort trying to stand. No hesitation rooted in limitation. Instead, everything he had was redirected into what remained possible. His arm drove forward, fast, precise, controlled by urgency, not panic. The object in his hand cut through the space between him and the snake, extending his reach beyond what his body alone could achieve. It was not about strength. It was about timing and direction. Every inch of that movement had to align with the exact point where the strike would begin. The snake reacted. Its body, already coiled, shifted in response to the sudden intrusion. The alignment it had formed was disrupted, not completely, but enough to break its focus for a fraction of a second. Its head adjusted, its posture altered, its attention divided between the target and the unexpected force entering its space. That fraction mattered. He did not stop. His arm continued through the motion, not pulling back, not hesitating after contact, but following through with enough force to push the snake off its path, to move it away from the baby's position, to create distance where there had been none. The baby remained still, unaware, unchanged, but now no longer directly in line with the threat. The snake recoiled, not fully retreating, but resetting. Its body shifted backwards slightly, its posture no longer perfectly aligned, its timing broken. The moment it had prepared for was gone. The precision it had built over seconds of silent movement had been interrupted in an instant, and that interruption changed everything. His arm lowered slightly, but not completely. He remained ready, focused, watching for any sign that the snake might attempt to re-establish its position. His breathing was controlled, but heavy with concentration. The effort had not been physical in the way most would expect, but it had required everything he could give within the limits of his body. Every part of the movement had been intentional, driven by awareness rather than reflex. The room began to change. The stillness broke. Voices started to rise, first in confusion, then in recognition as others began to understand what had just happened. Attention shifted rapidly toward the scene, drawn by the sudden movement, by the disruption that had broken the normal flow of the moment. But the most important part had already happened. The strike had been prevented, not avoided by chance, not delayed by luck, but interrupted by action that should not have been possible from someone in his position. He had not stood. He had not moved across the room. And yet, he had reached the exact point where it mattered most. That is what redefined the moment. Because movement is not always about distance. Sometimes it is about precision. And in that exact second, precision was enough to change the outcome. It was already in motion. Not fully released, not completed, but no longer in preparation. The transition had begun. The coiled tension within the snake's body had reached its peak, the exact point where instinct takes over and hesitation disappears. That is the moment where nothing can be stopped. Or at least, that is how it should have been. The snake's head moved forward with sudden precision, faster than any movement it had made before. The stillness that defined its approach vanished instantly, replaced by speed so sharp it barely registered as motion, only as change. A direct line from intention to impact. The baby was within reach. That is what made the moment final. There was no longer distance to absorb the action, no space left for adjustment. The strike, once initiated, would complete itself before anyone could react. It did not rely on strength. It relied on timing. And its timing had been perfect, until it was not. The disruption he created had shifted everything by just enough. The snake's trajectory was no longer exact. Its focus had been broken at the last possible instant, its alignment altered by the intrusion of force that did not belong in its calculation. What should have been a clean, direct movement became slightly off. Not by much, but enough. The strike passed through space that no longer contained the baby. It cut through air where a second earlier there had been vulnerability, where everything had aligned toward a single outcome. The difference was minimal in distance, but absolute in consequence. A fraction of a second, a shift of inches. That is all it took. The snake's head snapped forward, then halted, its body reacting to the missed target. its movement no longer flowing into completion, but breaking into recalibration. The precision it had built was gone. The certainty of the strike replaced by something unstable. It had missed, not because it failed, but because the moment had been changed. The baby remained untouched, unaware of how close the danger had come, unaware that the space it occupied had been exactly where the strike was meant to land, unaware that the outcome had already been decided and then rewritten. The snake recoiled again, more sharply this time, its body tightening as it pulled back from the failed strike. Its posture shifted from attack to reassessment, its focus now divided, no longer fixed entirely on the baby. The sequence had been broken, and once broken, it could not be restored in the same way. He did not move again immediately. He watched, carefully. Every detail of the snake's response mattered now. Whether it would attempt another strike, whether it would retreat, whether the threat had been neutralized or simply delayed. His awareness remained locked on it, just as it had been from the beginning. The room around them erupted into motion. Voices rose, louder now, urgent, filled with realization. People moved toward the baby, toward him, toward the source of the disruption that had just prevented something irreversible. But for that one moment, none of it mattered, because the most critical point had already passed. The strike that almost happened had been interrupted. And in that interruption, everything had changed. It should not have been enough. From where he was, with what he had, the outcome should have followed a different path. The distance was too great, the timing too precise, the limitation too absolute. Every factor pointed toward the same conclusion. He could not reach in time, and yet he did. Not in the way anyone would expect. Not through movement across the room, not through physical proximity, but through something far more exact. He reached the moment itself. The exact second where intervention could still change everything. That is what made it impossible to ignore, because this was not luck. Luck does not align with that level of precision. Luck does not interrupt a sequence already in motion at the exact fraction of time required to alter its outcome. What happened here was something else. It was calculated awareness translated into action without delay. The object in his hand had not been chosen carefully. There had been no time for that. It had simply been available. But in that moment, availability was enough. What mattered was not what he used, but how and when he used it. The angle, the speed, the timing. Every part of his movement had intersected with the snake's action at the only point where it could still be changed. Too early, and the snake would have adjusted. Too late, and the strike would have landed. But he did not act too early, and he did not act too late. He acted exactly when it mattered. That is why it worked. The snake's motion had been disrupted, not completely stopped, but shifted just enough to remove its accuracy. The target had moved. The alignment had broken. The sequence that had been building toward inevitability had been interrupted at its most critical point. And once interrupted, it could not return to what it had been. The baby was no longer in direct danger. The immediate threat had been displaced. The moment that should have ended in silence had instead been filled with movement, reaction, and realization. People rushed forward now. Hands reached toward the baby, lifting, pulling it away from the space that had just held danger. Voices overlapped, urgent, filled with shock and relief. The room, once calm, now carried the weight of what had almost happened. But at the center of it all, one fact remained clear. He had done something that should not have worked. From a position that offered no advantage, within a time frame that allowed no margin, against a threat that moved faster than reaction. And still, he had changed the outcome. He did not look for recognition. He did not speak. He did not shift his focus away from the snake until he was certain the danger had passed beyond immediate reach. Because for him, The moment was not about what had happened. It was about ensuring that nothing more would. That is what defined the intervention. Not just that it succeeded, but that it succeeded under conditions where success should not have been possible. And as the reality of that settled into the room, as the voices grew louder and the understanding deepened, one thing became undeniable. This was not an ordinary reaction. This was something precise, something exact, something that redefined what was possible within a moment that offered almost nothing. The moment was over. The snake had been pushed back. The baby was no longer in danger. The room, once unaware, now moved with urgency, with voices overlapping, with hands reaching to secure what had almost been lost. But what remained was not just relief. It was realization, because everything about what had just happened challenged expectation at its core. A man who could not stand had reached the moment faster than anyone else. A situation that required speed had been resolved without movement across distance. A threat that relied on precision had been stopped by something even more precise. And that is what stayed with everyone in that room. Not just that the baby was safe, but how it had been made safe. The world often defines strength in visible ways: movement, power, speed, the ability to act physically, to close distance, to respond with force. Those are the qualities most people recognize immediately. But in that moment, none of those were what mattered most. What mattered was awareness. What mattered was timing. What mattered was the decision to act within the exact second where action was still possible. He had not overcome his limitation. He had worked through it. He had not ignored reality. He had adapted to it. And in doing so, he had reached something beyond what most people expect from strength. He had reached precision. The baby rested now in safe hands, unaware of how close everything had come to ending differently. Its world remained unchanged, untouched by the danger that had existed only seconds before. But for everyone else, nothing felt the same, because they had seen something rare. A moment where limitation did not define outcome. A moment where awareness moved faster than ability. A moment where the person least expected to act became the only one who could. He remained where he was, calm, unchanged, not searching for attention, not reacting to the voices around him, not trying to explain what had just happened. For him, the action had been simple, necessary, immediate. There had been no choice, only a moment that required something to be done. And he had done it. That is what gave the moment its weight. Because it was not about proving anything. It was about responding when it mattered. The room slowly settled. The urgency faded. The movement softened. But the understanding remained. What they had witnessed was not just an act of quick thinking. It was something deeper. Something that forces a different question. What truly defines ability? Because when everything is reduced to a single second, when outcome depends on awareness and action rather than physical advantage, the answer changes. Strength is not always what the body can do. Sometimes it is what the mind refuses to ignore. And when that kind of strength meets the exact moment it is needed, it does not just change what happens next. It changes what people believe is possible.